Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the potential grey listing of South Africa by the Financial Actions Task Force. This is such a topical and important subject for both you and your clients, and I trust you're going to get so much value out of the time you're spending with us this morning. I'm Jennifer Anderson, the Head of Product and Communications for Innate. I'll be exploring this subject with Jabulo Duma, who is the Chief Compliance Officer of the Stanley Group. Jabulo's an absolute guru on this, and he's going to help us understand what this FATF grey listing is all about, how likely it is to take place, and what the implications could be for South Africa. A big welcome to you, Jabulo. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to unpack this subject with us.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you for inviting me. I am looking forward to this debate. Thank you.
So are we. A quick note on CPD. Details on CPD points will be confirmed after the session. As always with our webinars, we're very happy to take questions via the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try our best to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the session. We've got a lot to cover today, but we're definitely going to try to have some time at the end for a couple of your questions. To kick off, I think it's going to be useful to go through a few acronyms. I apologize in advance. I know acronyms aren't our favorites, but there are a lot when it comes to this piece of legislation that we're covering. So I think it's going to be useful. Let's put up a slide. And Jabulo, if you wouldn't mind just taking us through some of the key acronyms that we're going to need to get through the session today.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. And clearly one of the things that make this space so unattractive, it's definitely the acronyms that tend to play out here. So very quickly, so that we've got more time to spend on the content, I think others call it FATF. We refer to it as FATF, whichever you call it, but this is just your Financial Action Task Force, and we'll explain later what it does. Next up, we've got ICRG, which is your Intercooperative Review Group. This is the substructure within FATF, whose task and sole task is to mend and administer both the grey list and the blacklist, what we call enhanced monitored jurisdictions, effectively just to make sure that process applies science. It's not a thumbs up. AML, quite familiar. Again,
I know that one.
Taking money. So, sorry.
I said I know that one. That's probably the only one that I knew well on this.
And CFT, I think that one is easy. PEP is easy. DPIP, this is specific to SA, to South Africa, because we transitioned from a term PEP into DPIP. And here, if you remember anything about the difference between the two, in the old regime, under the rules-based regime, we had a definition of PEP, but we had Guptas who were so influential in government, but didn't meet the definition of PEP. So we needed to transition into something that captured beyond just your ordinary PEPs. UBO is your ultimate beneficial owner. The simple reference there is the warm body behind any legal structure. We normally say you just follow the warm body. Whoever sits at the back behind any legal structure that's your ultimate beneficial owner. LEAs, those are your law enforcement agencies, the likes of your FIUs, the likes of your NPA and the stuff. And then we've got FIU at the end, which is your financial intelligence units, that a global term for the likes of your FICA, of your center, Financial Intelligence Center in South Africa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Now that we're through some of the jargon, I think let's get straight into it. So over the last few months, we've suddenly been seeing a lot of headlines in the news about the FATF and this potential grey listing on the cards for South Africa. Can you explain to us, to start off with, what is the FATF, when was it started, and what do they actually do?
Good stuff. So we'll chat briefly later about why this debate is suddenly getting some prominence in the country and beyond South Africa. But briefly, FATF is a watchdog, a body that sits somewhere in Switzerland, whose only task is to coordinate all AML and CFT efforts across the globe. So somewhere in 1989, the then G7 recognized that issues of money laundering and terrorist financing were not just the monopoly of one country. They were a global concern already at that point. So that's what gave birth to FATF. That task of theirs is just to make sure that they coordinate all efforts across the globe, issue standards that each and every well-meaning country must adhere to, and that's what they do. Started in 1989 back then by G7.
Okay.
South Africa joined. I'm not sure if I could quickly just talk through that. I think it's got about 39 members currently. Jen, in the continent of Africa, only SA is a member of FATF. And as referred to ICRG earlier on in the definitions, so FATF also has got what we call regional style bodies, through which it dispenses most of its activities. So each continent has got a FATF kind of a body that's responsible for the continent in terms of coordinating those activities at a continental level. And here, this is where it comes in the likes of SMLAF, who South Africa is also a member of, but most of the countries in Africa are members of SMLAF, which is the regional style body under FATF. In Europe, you've got Manivel. In East Africa, you've got Gambia. So it operates in terms of those styles. 39 members, SA, the only member in Africa, but it's got regional style bodies through which it does most of its things there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it safe to say, I think it's sort of fairly obvious from the naming conventions they use, but it's not a good thing to be on the FATF grey list. Is that right? Can you take us through that? And should we also have a look at whose illustrious company we'd be joining if we were to end up on that list?
Jen, that's true. So it's definitely never a good thing to be in the FATF grey list. I mean, SA joined in 2003, 2 years after it had issued its first AML type act, which is what we know as FICA. And it's had 3 assessments by FATF at this stage, the latest one being in 2019, in terms of which is why we are having this particular debate. So, the benefits that come with being a FATF member directly are just massive. And the downside of having to be grey listed by FATF for reasons that are contrary to what FATF stands for in the first instance is just damning. So that's just the high degree of why you definitely never want to be on that list. Currently,
I've just popped up a screen here for us to have a look at who's currently on the grey list. Can you talk us through this a little bit?
Great stuff. So currently, you have 23 countries that are part of that grey list. Firstly, you could be grey listed by FATF, whether you're a direct member or a member of their regional style body. They could easily grey list. So we've got 23 countries in that list currently, and you've got 2 countries in the blacklist. That's your Iran and your North Korea. And you can imagine the double jeopardy that comes with being in the blacklist, because it's not always only about what you are not doing. It's also about what you are doing, which is contrary to the objectives of what FATF stands for. But in the grey list, it's about 23 countries. And I mean, you can see the countries that will be side by side should this event eventuate. And here you're talking about Haiti, you're talking about South Sudan, you're talking about Libya, and you imagine the profile of South Africa as a central hub in the continent to be in a list like that. It's also worth noting, Jen, that Zimbabwe was in the list until March. So Zimbabwe goes off the list, and South Africa is at the brink of facing that eventuality. In the context of the continent that we live in, it just doesn't look like a good picture. That
Yeah, I mean, actually unbelievable to think that Zimbabwe, across the fence, but I think we always consider ourselves a more mature country from a financial organization standpoint. They went on the list and they've subsequently come off. So I found that fascinating when I found that out. I also find it interesting that you don't have to be a FATF member to actually become grey listed or blacklisted by the FATF. So that's something that I don't think is that obvious in all of these articles I've read, which is quite key. Great, thank you so much. Can you take us through why are we potentially being put on this grey list? How did we get here?
So, Jen, that's a very good question. So two ways to look into engaging that particular question. So firstly, it's the technical content and the process that comes from FATF. So in 2019, and this is the process that started at the beginning of 2019. And here, particularly for me and some of my colleagues, this is the debate we are having for fifth time now. So when we were participating in the process itself, being grilled by the assessors of FATF in 2019, fast forward to when the draft report was being issued and the industry was given an opportunity to comment, the FIC was leading that process. And then October 2021, October 2019, sorry, the report is getting released, the final one adopted by the plenary at the FATF level. The outcome of the report says that we've got, so out of 11 immediate outcomes through which FATF assesses the effectiveness of any country's AML CFT regime, South Africa scored about 8 of those 11 outcomes as moderate effectiveness. So this is if you take low risk, low, medium, high, we were in the middle. So we scored about 8 of those immediate outcomes under moderate, and the rest of the 3 was low. And we had none under substantial effectiveness. So there's nothing that sits under substantial effectiveness. Majority located in the medium, and then you've got 3 at the low. And those low are insensitive outcomes out of the 11. And we'll chat about that just as we go on with the debate. So that's at a technical level in terms of FATF methodology, why they felt we weren't really in a good space. But there's history here. So if you deviate slightly from the content of FATF, there's a history that says to you, signs have been there in terms of how South Africa has progressed over time. FATF introduced this thing called risk-based approach in 2007. FATF at a global level. South Africa only adopted that in 2017. The likes of Namibia next door were on a risk-based approach in 2012 already. So you've got South Africa lagging behind some of these global concepts when it pushes itself as a hub in the continent and obviously matured compared to the rest of it. So that's point one in terms of the delay on us aligning to the global requirements. The second point, you'd remember when we introduced the risk-based approach in 2017, transitioning from a rules-based in terms of the old act into a risk-based approach, there was a huge contest. I mean, that piece of legislation was only signed by the then administration, Jacob Zuma then, at the threat of some of the NGOs threatening to take him to court because it just wouldn't go anywhere, right? Coupled with that, the transitioning from a PEP to a DP meant that there was a contest because people felt that it was covering others that they would have preferred to keep behind the scene. And here I make reference to the Guptas because it's public information. On the same concept, and it ties to the findings of FATF, PEP, the global theory of PEP, it says once a PEP, always a PEP, right? You are a politician or a politically exposed person, you will forever be one. But South Africa, because the old administration wanted to manage itself out of those requirements, said you are a PEP and you cease to be a PEP six months after leaving office, which was quite irregular in the context of your global standard. So these are just the many things that are happening. And maybe the last 2 points, look at the context of what's happening in SA in terms of your, what we call predicate offenses activities. These are your corruption, your fraud, and tax evasion and those kind of stuff. There's quite heavy set of activities taking place. But we only have one case of convicted terrorist financing activity, a Nigerian by the name of Henry Kofa in 2013. Now, that one statistic in the context of so many activities tells you a solid statement about our seriousness with which we deal with this. We also have one case of a convicted money launderer, albeit with a few predicate offenses cases convicted, but quite disproportionate to the activities that are taking place in the country. And that input feeds into how FATF applies its methodology in assessing our effectiveness as a country. So in summary, there's a technical component that comes from the FATF methodology and how they look at us, but there's also a background in the context of SA that just builds into the narrative that, maybe we need to do a little bit more to align to the global standards.
Okay, that's fascinating. So, I mean, basically to say that we fairly conveniently left out a few key pieces of legislation that other countries have in place. So, for example, that once you're politically exposed, you are always politically exposed, which I think is fair. And then also the other side of it, that even the rules we have in place, we don't seem particularly good at enforcing and policing. Okay. And I mean, I must say, and I'm sure many of our advisors listening today feel the same way that I do. It feels like in the private sector, we are inundated with compliance-related tick boxes that we have to do, and that we really do go above and beyond in terms of complying with all these rules. So I see a thumbs up coming as well, so somebody agrees with me. So is this problem that the FATF's identified a public sector problem and a lawmaker problem? And are we sort of getting a green light in the private sector? Or are there problems in the private sector as well that were identified? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, so thanks, Jenna. I think that's a nice question. So there's a 30-70% split, right? And certainly that's how I look at it. So out of the 100, you've got 70% located in the public sector in the lawmaking environment. And then you've got the 30% located in the private sector space, and I'll elaborate briefly on that. So if your question is, private sector is doing so much, that's true. But if the FATF outcome was anything to go by, really there's a journey that we need to travel as the private sector still. If I look at the public sector environment, for instance, out of the 11 immediate outcomes that FATF utilized, and there are 40 technical compliance questions that deal with the 40 recommendations, and you extract the priority actions that FATF said we must do. I wanted to theme them into, let's say, 4. So one is the strength of our legislative environment, and I'll briefly mention key points, and I've spoken about PEP. FATF feels that our philosophy on PEP is inadequate. So we've got to fix that. FATF feels that how we legislate and apply the concept of UBO is also inadequate. So the strength and the cohesiveness of your legislative framework is one theme that FATF felt in the public sector and the lawmaking space is a thing to deal with. The second thing is the capacity of your law enforcement agencies. And again, FATF had so much to say about this because we also experience it in South Africa. You look at the many commissions of inquiry that are taking place and reports being released, but you don't see a proportionate amount of convictions being pursued in respect of those outcomes, right? You talk about NPA's capacity and expertise and competencies to pursue those cases up until conviction. That's not the kind of stuff you hear more than the commissions of inquiry, the findings, the cases, and that kind of. So the FATF says the capacity and the technical competencies and the expertise of your law enforcement agencies is one thing to deal with. So that's a second thing. The third thing, FATF says, yes, you've got laws that are already prevailing subject to the amendments you need to make, but we also don't see metrics that tell us that those laws are properly enforced. And here you talk about the fines that are being issued in the industry. We are beginning to see some of those coming up now. But relative to, on one hand, the inspections that are being conducted by the regulatory authorities and the penalties being issued, FATF says that story is not giving us confidence that you guys are effectively supervising the legislation that you have. So roughly those are, and maybe the last one is just about the treaties that we have with other countries where we need to recover some of those assets in instances of predicate offenses having been committed in South Africa. FATF says, the strength of those treaties, you are effectively struggling to bring back some people that committed crimes in South Africa, because the strength of those treaties is now being tested. And that's exactly the comment that FATF said. So in the public sector, that's the 70% that's sitting there. The private sector, FATF says, guys, having transitioned from a rules-based approach in the old days into a risk-based approach in 2017, you do not understand your risk for you to apply appropriate measures to manage that risk. And the simple concept here is the risk-based approach that we apply. Do you understand the risk of a client you are taking on board vis-a-vis the controls you are applying? So FATF says there's a disconnect there that you need to fix as a private sector. And that's pretty much where the, call it 30% is located in the context of the private sector. But the majority of it is in the public sector, as you said.
Okay. So, I mean, really then for the private sector, it's more about applying our minds to the risk-based approach rather than just applying a tick box, which I suppose was the whole move from rules to risk, but maybe a bigger mind shift and more resources required to do that properly than we're doing. That's a resource-intensive activity for sure. So, Jobs, where to from here? So I see the Reserve Bank back in May reporting that they thought progress on addressing all these gaps was going slowly, and they actually had a high expectation that we were going to end up on the grey list. Whose problem is this to fix if we say it's 70% sitting in the public sector, and what are they doing about it?
So, yeah, Jen, I suppose that's a slightly difficult question in the context of where we are, and we spoke to the Mauritians recently because they come from a similar experience in terms of how they dealt with something like this. So where to from here? Really, there's a process perspective to the question that says, having been given 18 months, having been put into a monitored process for 18 months, given a year within which to fix our house, that year is coming into expiry in the next few months, right? Next month, which is October. We've submitted the first report in April. The second one went in June. The last one goes out in October. That's the report that FATF uses in February 2023 to make a determination on whether or not South Africa has satisfactorily remediated what they needed to remediate. So October is a critical date for the country, and that's the process. If you wanted to think about where to from here, that's one element. There's a second element that says, really, there's a task at hand that South Africa has to attend to. We are now seeing until 15th of August or thereabout, an omnibus bill that's gone into the public. Disappointing that the timelines are still beyond the date of October. That's dealing one of the issues. We are not hearing anything about the recruitment drive to capacitate our law enforcement agencies, as well as the efficiency of our supervisory authorities. So those are still taking a bit of a strain. So that's exactly where we are now. And we are just observing the date of October to see what the authorities have got in hand for FATF. So that's in terms of where to from here. Whose problem is it to fix? We've got an intergovernmental committee led by the National Treasury that consists of the regulators, your FSCA, Prudential Authority, the National Treasury, and they are responsible for coordinating all the efforts in terms of addressing some of this. And the regulators, I can say, are doing extremely good job in terms of pursuing some of those that are located in their space. We are seeing national risk assessments being issued. We are seeing a lot of questions being posed into the industry as to its understanding of its risk. So those conversations are taking place in the background, and the guys are doing extremely well. The constraint is just with the lawmakers, as it were, as we've experienced over time now.
And I mean, I had a real chuckle when I saw that draft bill come out on the 15th of August. It's sort of a mishmash of a whole lot of things, and obviously very targeted at trying to plug these gaps. But I mean, you and I know, Jubs, we deal with this often. For a law to get from a first draft all the way through to promulgation in a matter of months feels really ambitious, even with all the will in the world. And as you mentioned, it's more than just that. You need to strengthen your law enforcement agencies. And in that call with Mauritius, they mentioned that those people are hard to find. You're not going to pick up, an AML and terror financing expert off the side of the road. These are scarce skilled resources that you can't either skill up or acquire quickly. So maybe too little, too late. It sort of feels like with some of these things.
That's exactly how it feels like, and I mean, we've got a different type of the bills that get introduced. We've got what we call a Section 76 bill, which has to be attended to in both houses of parliament, and this stems from your finance type related bills. And it takes time, because that means engagement, debates, contestation, and that kind of stuff. Yes, the timelines are quite ambitious. And to your point about the Mauritius guys, we hear that in South Africa, that the very reason that we do not have LEAs as strong as they should be right now is a question of budget, and a question of availability of those expertise in the jurisdiction in South Africa. Both those complications combined mean for you to satisfy a body like FATF that you are doing something about this thing, it's not a month's type of an effort. It's a long-term effort. You really need to invest in thinking about that.
Something that really struck me in that conversation with Mauritius was just how often they mentioned how much political will is needed to push this thing over the line. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. I'm going to break quickly for a question, because I see we've had a question come through that I think fits in well with where we're at now. And the question's from Keith. Thanks very much, Keith. And the question is, what influence does OFAC, and for those of us who don't know, that's the Office of Foreign Control, have in relation to FATF?
So what influence does OFAC have in relation to FATF? Very little, if any at all. OFAC is a body responsible for administering sanctions that are originating from the US environment. Whereas FATF, it's a global body that has got standards and methodologies through which it does what it does. So these two aren't really connected. The point I may add is that we've seen in the previous instances where there's a grey listing of a country, the European Union takes a similar position, as well as the US. But really, OFAC isn't involved, because OFAC only gets involved when it has to be about sanctions that are originating from the US relations with people and countries. But you will see the European Union taking a position once FATF is a grey listed entity.
Okay, great question. Thank you, Keith. So Jubs, I'm going to put you on the spot. In your opinion, how likely do you think it is that we're going to end up on this grey list?
Sure. Jen, that's a tricky one. Clearly, if you asked me before the 15th of August, I was going to say 99% it's likely that it's going to happen. And with the release of this omnibus, mini omnibus bill, that's reducing to about 70%, coupled with the other efforts that are being driven by the regulatory authorities in the context of national risk assessments and that kind of stuff. The reason it's 70% is because here you are at the mercy of FATF understanding your good faith in the actions you've put together to want to meet their requirements. And I don't know how much of good faith will earn you points with the plenary, because they've got standards and methodologies through which they do what they do. And they are always wary of making precedents that will interfere with their work in future. So if they operate on the basis of this is the requirement, this is the standard, this is the methodology we applied, and unfortunately you fall outside of that, the likely outcome is grey listing. Yes, the efforts are quite appreciated and noted, but we just don't know how much of that is going to count in our advantage, as it were.
Okay. And if we assume that we are grey listed, what happens from there? How do we get reassessed? When does that happen? You obviously want to get off the list as soon as you can, but from what we've seen, getting off the list can be a lot harder than getting on the list, and it can take quite a while.
Sure. Exactly. Jen, and I mean, I suppose we'll talk about the implications and the effects later, but the process is once you are on that grey list, and maybe for this, in one of my interactions in Europe recently, there's one prominent commentator who says, you just want to optimize agency before you get onto that list. Because once you get onto that list, trust me, that entire agency goes away. And that's why you find, the likes of Yemen and Syria are the longest serving members of that list, if I may put it in that way. They've been on that list for about 7 years, when, as you rightly point out, the average time to be there is about 3 years. So that's what it takes. In terms of the process, effectively in Feb 2023, the FATF plenary sits and makes a decision. We as South Africa will know in October, because we submit that report, and clearly somewhere the links are going to happen, and we'll figure out what the status is going to look like. But the rest of the world will only know in March, when a new list gets published. So a list gets published in March for everyone to see. Once you get onto that grey list, Jen, you've got agreement with FATF, because you are now a highly monitored jurisdiction. And you've got timelines that you submit to them to say, guys, this is when I will fix my affairs. It will take A, B, C, and D. But that process is a lot more stronger than where we are right now. And it's often dependent on your agreement as a country with FATF in terms of when you will fix it. So if you agree and you commit and you deliver, you are out of that list in the committed timelines. Mauritius committed about 20 months, and they were there 2 months before that entire period. So it's about the period that you agree with FATF once you are on that list, in terms of when you will have satisfactorily implemented what they ask of you. And then in between, they make assessments of their own in terms of your regular visits and checks up. So that's pretty much what's going to happen once you are in the list.
Okay. And moving on, I think this is what everybody now wants to know. Help us understand what a grey listing would mean for South Africa. So I've heard that it can be worse than a junk status downgrade, for example. And if we look at Pakistan, whose economy is roughly the same size as ours, they got grey listed in 2018. And 2018 to 2019, they lost 600 billion rands worth of economic activity as a result of that grey listing. So that sounds dire. That sounds really serious. Can you talk us through, I know you've done a lot of scenario analysis. What is that grey listing going to mean for us?
So, Jen, maybe I think that's a more meaty question just to spend some time on, because currently there's at least 3 papers released by the IMF and other scholars, which test the impact of a grey list pre, during, and post the announcement. The latest one was released in May, which expands on the capital flows, and we'll talk about that just now. And there's another one that tested the SWIFT payments from the outside world into the country that's just gone on the grey list. And the outcome of that paper says there's an immediate drop of about 7 to 10% of the payments that come into the country once you are placed on that grey list. Now, if you pause and reflect on that just for a moment, and then others are also reflecting on what happens. But if I expand a little bit on the one released by the IMF in May, which talks about the capital flows and what happens in the context of the country that goes into a grey listing. Immediately, their assessment is there's an immediate shock building towards the announcement, because the locals would know that that's what it's likely to be about, and they are not sure when and how to play that particular scenario. So that immediate shock was noted by the IMF, and there's a decline of your gross capital flows that effectively just in the industry of around 3%. Sorry, that's about 7 to 10%. That was noted. Purposely for the investment professionals on the line, the portfolio inflows dip about 2% in terms of that particular research, 2.9% that dips into your portfolio flows, and that's the money that we get that comes into the funds that we sell to our clients. Those are just your small areas in terms of the impact that it has once it gets into that particular grey listing from an economic perspective. And that's to be said. There are FDIs, and we could refer people to that particular paper to engage it if they wish just to expand the insights on that. There is a non-economic impact, Jen, that is also likely to occur in a scenario of this nature. And here you are talking about issues of your compliance costs that will immediately escalate. Because what tends to happen is that once you are placed on the grey list, there are 3 key sensitive jurisdictions that we always think about: the EU, the UK, and the US. Those are loyal members to FATF, right? So if anything happens with you being grey listed, they immediately take a response. As a matter of fact, recently EU released a directive that says any entity that deals with an entity in a grey listed country has got us to deal with as regulators in the environment. And immediately that's a disincentive for anyone to engage with you. Let alone the risk rating of your clients, which means the majority of your clients are scoring you high risk, and it attracts an enhanced due diligence, and you've got to now deal with more requirements than you ordinarily have dealt. And that needs funding, right? Because that's not something you ordinarily have thought about at first instance. The last one, which is massive, we operate on the basis of reliance arrangements with our global partners as the industry, on the basis that they trust us being members of FATF, that the quality of our due diligence checks meet the global standards. If FATF takes a view, it means all of those reliance arrangements are falling away. And effectively here you find global partners having to do due diligence on clients of ours, right? So it crosses us now down into our own clients. And you can imagine that being a disincentive for anyone to want to do that. So there's quite a number of implications, both from an economic perspective as pronounced by some of those scholars and the research and the researchers, plus your non-economic stuff in terms of the compliance costs and the administrative costs that come with an event of this nature.
And Jabs, what about state-owned enterprises? I mean, surely, our state-owned enterprises heavily indebted. Some of them, I think I read an article that said Eskom has more than 40% offshore debt. What's going to happen to those debts in that situation if we go on the grey list?
Now, Jen, I'm glad you raised that point, because what tends to happen, and we've seen this recently as part of engaging in this debate, is that our SOEs raise their funding from global markets, which is ordinarily a known fact. But what we've begun to see is those supranational entities, your FDRs, your foreign, your development finance institutions, beginning to put in their terms continued membership with FATF, because they also, so within FATF, they also are affiliate members. And most of your DFRs, your development finance institutions, serve as affiliate members at a FATF level. So they have an obligation to advance the objectives of what FATF stands for. And they do that by making some of their contract terms to include continued membership with FATF, clean expression by FATF and those kind of things. So when now SOEs raise money in global markets and some of those conditions are there, and FATF takes a view that we deserve a grey list, it effectively means to them it's either some of those contracts are impacted, and you can imagine the impact that's going to come with that. Transnet just recently closed a $1 billion worth of a deal in global markets. That's going to have an impact. Whether those DFIs will continue to advance funding is left to be seen, because then it cuts against what they stand for as FATF participants in that context.
So if I can sum it up, it sounds like the impact is going to be less money coming in, both for SOEs, for local investment managers that manage offshore funds, because people don't want to put their money in a country that's seen to be not up to scratch from an AML perspective. That's the one side of it. But the other side of it is South Africans wanting to invest offshore are going to have a lot harder time doing that, because people don't want to deal with us as investors. Because, and I see we've got a great comment here from Stuart saying that the cost of due diligence, as you said, Jubs, for people living in South Africa could go through the roof. Instead of having to ask for 3 pieces of information, you're now going to need a chest x-ray and a blood test for every South African.
Yeah.
So Stuart's comment, really, really interesting, to say they had an investment advisory practice in Mauritius. And when Mauritius was grey listed, most of the European banks simply applied a blanket ban on that practice rather than undertaking that enhanced due diligence. So I think that's so fascinating. It's obviously a horrible situation, but really useful comment to just say it's not just money coming in. It's going to get difficult potentially for people to take money out. And I can imagine in this scenario, there's going to be tons of investors calling up their advisors and saying, this is concerning me, can I take more money out? Because that's typically how we see investors reacting to bad news like this.
Yeah, Jen, spot on. So the double jeopardy that exists here, you've got offshore players. Firstly, you've got locals wanting to externalize their money and take it offshore, running away from the effects of an event of this nature. But the offshore players have got less risk appetite to deal with assets that originate from a country that's grey listed, right? So you've got these two facing off, and that's the space that most of our financial advisors and product providers in South Africa will find themselves. If you do that before the announcement, and you are successful in doing that, it effectively means you need to manage the expectations of your client, because once it happens, you will come back for extra information from that client. So you've summarized that quite perfectly. It's just a yeah.
And we all know how much clients love us coming back for extra information later. That's definitely something that doesn't go down well. We've been on the receiving end of that many times. So as we near the end, so we clear up some space and time for questions. Jubs, what would you say the number one thing is that you think advisors should be talking to about their clients when it comes to this risk?
Sure. Jen, I don't know how much time we have, but I think maybe in terms of if I were to summarize just the key takeaways for our advisors as they navigate a journey like this, I've got just about 5 themes, and I'll be very brief to equip them and make sure that all of us are feel a little bit more equipped to navigate a scenario we've never faced before. The one, think about your enhanced due diligence. So effectively, I think we've spoken in detail about that, and Keith has contributed into the debate, but that effectively means the clients of an advisor who in turn route to a product provider, the expectations that we manage through that process, are likely to set up us either for failure or success. So the better we manage those expectations on the side of our clients, the better for all of us, because that should trigger a conversation with our clients to say, guys, we are navigating an unknown territory. We understand it to give these particular effects, and please bear with us as we do just that. And we as advisors will in turn face that hurdle from the product providers, because they now need to go and revise their risk-based approach, their RMCPs, to make sure that it covers an incident of this nature with the type of risk that, a client like this. So they'll be coming back to us for more information. And in turn, we go back to our clients for more information. We as advisors may be clients of other people, which means we also need to start thinking about our own UBOs, our own PEPs and that kind of stuff, so that we better prepare ourselves for that particular eventuality. That's number one. Two, your offshore engagements, you better, start warming up and engaging them so that you better understand what they would look for should an event of this nature materialize in that particular context. You've got risk rating, and we mentioned the understanding of the risk by the private sector, which was found to be hugely inadequate. We no longer deal these things as grudge purchases, because what FATF invites us to do is to start being meaningful in how we invest our thoughts and efforts in these particular processes, because they help us become a better country. We must not deal with monies that come from the wrong people, and we must clear them out ourselves. So the risk rating stream means you go back and revise your risk rating methodologies and philosophies so that they meet what will be when an event like this happens. And then we've got a scenario planning process that must start taking place. Your fundamental assumptions as a business, strategy-wise, will be hugely invalidated once this thing happens, because effectively your costs are going up, your processes are changing, the engagement model with your clients is changing, your engagement model with your providers is changing. So there's a few things that you just need to tackle, and I thought that those would be useful insights to take away just in concise format, in the interest of time.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. We're going to kick off some questions now. Before we do that, I'm very excited to let everybody know in our audience today that our head of distribution, Georgina Smith, will be speaking to Paul Forsten on building and managing an ethical culture in your firm on the 6th of September. So I think after we've all listened to Jabulo today, I can't even emphasize how important that is, because these things go hand in hand. So please keep an eye out for invitations on that, and those should be coming out, I think, today. So let us go to our Q&A. I think some of these we've probably addressed to an extent. Question here about when is the actual hard and fast deadline, Jobs? So we know it's October. Is that when we submit our final report? So we've got until then to do some sort of mad scramble and get our act together.
Yeah, exactly. The final deadline is October. When FATF sits in February, they look at the October report. So your hard deadline is October, effectively.
Very interesting question here. I'm not sure if we're equipped to answer it, but if we're not, we'll certainly take it away and get you an answer from Craig. It said, could the grey listing also have an effect or impact on the 1 million offshore allowance? That's the annual offshore allowance that people can take offshore without a tax directive. So I suppose the question is, will it affect South Africa's own exchange control?
I don't know. Jen, I think that's an interesting question, and fairly I don't know. So that's something we may want to just take away and test. Yeah.
Very, very interesting question. I see there's also a couple of questions around what the effect's going to be on the JSE, our exchange rates, our interest and inflation rates. I think Jabs and I aren't investment experts, so that's probably beyond our ambit. But all I will say, and Jabulo, you're welcome to also comment, is I've read a few differing opinions on this. So some of the opinions say that this has been baked in to an extent, so that shock when the news gets announced, if it does get announced, will be minimal. And I think we saw that pretty much when we got downgraded. It had kind of already been priced in to the risk premium of the country. But I've seen other reports, and you said the IMF also reported that there is a shock effect when a grey listing is announced. Jabs, I mean, I know you and I aren't investment managers by any means, but what's your opinion on that?
So Jenny, you're right. I think that's more an investment question, but maybe we could play out just those two scenarios. The one point to emphasize is that there is no debate about this thing likely to happen. Wherever you hear, whether it's Brown in Nedbank, whether it's Sim in Standard Bank, whether it's BASA, BLSA and Mavuso, the concern is, guys, this thing is right ahead of us. The only difference amongst the participants in the debate is the extent of an impact. Brownfields, it's already been priced, as you rightly said, in the risk premium of the country. Sim takes an extreme view, whether you believe him or you don't. And you made reference to the SAB report. As a matter of fact, in its risk and assessment and vulnerability assessment, SAB thinks it's going to have a heavy shock. And that's what that's the assumption that they are working on. So if you look at the two scenarios, others feeling it's going to have a negligible impact, and we've got minorities in that scenario. Brown in Nedbank is one of those. And then you've got a scenario that says it's damning, both economic and otherwise. Sim and the likes and SAPA are in that scenario. The assumptions they make in that scenario, just briefly, is one, we already hear the emergence of this failed state theory going on in the country, and they think this thing builds into that narrative. Number two, they also think it's a point of no return in our efforts to demonstrate at a global stage what we mean, just because of what I pointed out earlier in the context of many things happening in the country and very minimal action we see being taken. So people are thinking this is definitely a point of no return. And given the impact that the DFIs have on the source of funding of our SOEs, which is a huge component, and also feel that may have an impact, it's going to introduce a huge shock in that environment. So those are assumptions being made by the people in that particular scenario. But again, just a remark that we are engaging the investment experts to determine that kind of impact in your JSEs and the stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm losing you a little bit. Can you hear me, James?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me, James?
Okay, great. Yes, temporary glitch in the matrix there. So I think as well, potentially, while the markets have factored it in, there's some things that will only occur when that grey listing takes place. So, some clauses will kick in certain loan agreements. We'll go onto EU lists, and only at that point, certain foreign fund managers will act. As we had a comment from the audience earlier, we could get businesses who do business overseas could get blanket banned or substantially increased costs. So I think all of those things have a snowball effect, not to mention the fact that it might be more difficult for investors to invest offshore. We've got one last question that I think we've got time for, and it's from Greg. The question is, surely the banks have a huge responsibility around all of this. For starters, how do they allow so many crooks to open accounts? Before you answer that, I will mention one interesting stat I read on this, and that is that in 2021, the banks collectively reported almost 400,000 suspicious transactions to the regulator. So I certainly think there's activity in the banking space around controlling this. Maybe it's not enough, and Jabs, you can comment on that. But also maybe it's down the line that we're falling short. What happened to those 400,000 suspicious transaction reports? Who dealt with them in the law enforcement agencies? What were the outcomes, and did anything come of it? I think that all kind of feeds into this question.
Yeah. So Jenna, another interesting, thanks for that. And I think this that you shared is quite revealing. What you find is that the obligations that bank have is to report this kind of activities, right? Report them to the FIC, and the FIC does the consolidation of all of these reports and submit this to the law enforcement agencies to do their work. And that's why the test about the capacity and the effectiveness of your law enforcement agencies is coming through, because information feed does take place as expected. It's just a question that there's no one who does anything about it. So, I mean, banks are not without a proportionate amount of responsibility and accountability in their context. But the majority of them is, once they've given the authorities information about what's taking place, what do the authorities do about that? Yeah?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think I'm struggling a little bit with my signal, but I think it's on my side, so I trust everybody caught all of that. I think let's call it there. Jubs, it has been such a pleasure to have you with us. It was absolutely fascinating. And I just think so insightful. I can't say that I think all of our audience is going to walk away feeling full of joy after this webinar, but really so empowering to just know where we are, know the facts. And yeah, I think just be empowered to chat to all of our clients about this freight train that's coming for us. I mean, I always feel like the more prepared we are, the better position we're in to actually manage all of these things. And you never know. I always feel like with South Africa, we do sometimes manage to pull the rabbit out the hat. So let's all, I suppose, plan for the worst and hope and pray for the best. Yeah, and we'll all be watching this space extremely closely come October and next year, February. Thanks very much to everybody for joining us, and thanks again to you, Jubs.
Innate is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorized financial services provider.